Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of John E. Kelly's The Twilight of World Trotskyism, and this chapter is titled A Brief Account of the Four Main Centers of World Trotskyism: Argentina, Britain, France, and the USA. Despite a presence in 69 countries around the world, the Trotskyist movement in most of these countries is organizationally small and politically irrelevant. The largest Trotskyist organizations in the world, both today and in the past, have been concentrated in just a few countries, and only a handful have ever claimed membership figures close to or above 10,000. The Movimiento al Socialismo, MAS Argentina, in the early 1980s, in Britain the militant tendency in the Workers' Revolutionary Party in the mid-1980s, and the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1990s, the French Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste, NPA, in 2009-10. Historically, the American Socialist Workers' Party was for many years the largest party in the Fourth International. The American Socialist Workers' Party membership in 1938 was around 1,500, and 10 years later, the American Socialist Workers' Party had fallen back only slightly to 1,277, according to LeBlanc 2016. The other large parties, in turn, have played a key role in the creation of new international bodies, such as the MAS, which formed the Liga Internacional de los Trabajadores, Cuarta Internacional, LITCI, and the Committee for the Workers International, CWI, created by the militant tendency, as well as the various internationals constructed on the back of national splits and expulsions, see below. The upshot is that by 2022 there are now 32, quote, Fourth Internationals, end quote, but it is their geographical concentration that is striking. 26 of these 32 organizations are headquartered in just 4 countries. 8 in the USA, 7 in Argentina, 6 in Britain, and 5 in France. Because these 4 countries are home to the clear majority of French internationals and have contained most of the largest ever Trotskyist parties, they should be considered as the 4 major centers of world Trotskyism. Argentina. The first Trotskyist group in Argentina, indeed in the whole of Latin America, was the Comité Comunista de Oposición, launched in 1929 by dissident members of the Argentina Communist Party, and shortly afterwards renamed the Liga Comunista Internacionalista. Where am I? Let's make sure this is recording here. Okay, it is in fact recording. Trotsky's new policy of entrism into socialist or social democratic parties, the 1934, quote, French turn, end quote, split the Trotskyist movement in Argentina as it did in Britain, France, and the USA, so that by 1940 there were 3 Trotskyist groups in the country. The minuscule size of each led to partially successful unity talks whose outcome was the creation of the Partido Obrero de la Revolución Socialista in 1941, and a total membership of just 75. 2 years later, however, the fledgling movement was faced simultaneously with 2 of the key issues that would plague it for the remainder of the century: a military coup and the rise of Peronism, a national populist political movement. Juan Perón supported the 1943 coup and gradually built support among sections of workers and their unions, leading to his presidential electoral victory in 1946. The Trotskyist movement was divided, with one wing supporting, quote, Peronism as a progressive force against U.S. imperialism, whilst the other, more orthodox wing defined the Peronist movement as a primarily bourgeois social force that revolutionaries should challenge. Such was the influence of Peronism that by 1954 even its critics in the Partido Obrero de la Revolucionario, the Fourth International's Argentinian affiliate, had adopted an entrist approach to a major pro-Peronist party. In 1953, the Fourth International split as the American Socialist Workers' Party objected to the Fourth International's new policy of long-term factional activity inside social democratic or communist parties. The Argentinian movement was equally divided. Juan Posadas, and his supporters remained with the mainstream Fourth International, whilst Nahuel Moreno and his followers joined the British, French, and American defectors in a new International Committee of the Fourth International, ICFI, to defend Trotskyist orthodoxy. Perón was overthrown by another military coup in 1955, which was soon followed by elections, but the Trotskyist groups remained either too weak or too beholden to Peronist parties to stand independently in any of the 5 elections between 1958 and 1966, the year of the next coup. Military dictatorships had now become widespread in Latin America and Central America, and the group of long-standing dictatorships in countries such as Paraguay and Nicaragua was supplemented with fresh dictatorships following coups in Ecuador, Guatemala, and Honduras, all in 1963, and Argentine neighbors Brazil and Bolivia, both 1964. Debate now raged across Latin America within the Fourth Internationals about the appropriate response to such regimes. On one side, there were those who believed clandestine political activity should be the main focus for Trotskyists, but they were outflanked by growing numbers who now believed that Cuban-style guerrilla warfare was the road to socialism. The main Trotskyist group at this time, the Partido Revolucionario de Trabajadores, PRT, split into pro- and anti-guerrilla groups, adding to the organizations led by Juan Posadas, architect of yet another Fourth International from 1964, and the Partido Obrero, founded by Jorge Altamira in 1966 and still in existence today. There was a brief period of democracy from 1973 until the 1976 coup installed the most brutal regime in the country's history, which abducted and murdered at least 20,000 people and completely wiped out the Trotskyist guerrilla groups. Nonetheless, the main Trotskyist organization, the Partido Socialista de los Trabajadores, PST, formerly PRT, had nurtured antagonism to the regime, and a year prior to the Falklands/Malvinas War had acquired a membership of almost 5,000 under the leadership of the veteran Trotskyist Nahuel Moreno. In 1982, it transformed itself into a more broadly based organization, the MAS, a leading force in a new Fourth International, the LITCI, International Workers' League Fourth International. The strategic goal of MAS was to spearhead a, quote, democratic revolution, end quote, in pursuit of which it constructed electoral alliances with the Communist Party and leftist Peronist groups. Its overambitious claims were cruelly exposed in the 1985 and 1987 elections, when it obtained 2.3% and 0.35% of the popular vote, respectively. Moreno's death in 1987 precipitated a crisis of leadership within the MAS. Groups of members disappointed by its poor electoral performance turned their fire on Moreno's thesis of a, quote, democratic revolution, end quote, portraying it as an abandonment of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Several hundred militants split from MAS in 1988 to form the first of 9 breakaway groups in a process of disintegration and decline, similar to those that occurred in Britain and the USA in the early 1980s, see below. In response to the neoliberal policies of the Menem government that ruled for 10 years from 1989, the trade union movement also split as a new, more militant confederation. The Central de Trabajadores de la Argentina was created. I don't know, how do you say Argentina? Is it Argentina? Is G? I don't know. Sometimes you hear G's not like pronounced like J's, like with an H sound, I think, but like there's a guy I knew named Hermann, but it looked like German. Anyway, the Central de Trabajadores de la Argentina, or Argentina, was created in 1991. Accumulated grievances finally spilled over into a wave of unrest in December 2001, marked by a general strike, roadblocks, factory occupations, and riots that led to frequent ministerial resignations and policy concessions. The increasingly fragmented Trotskyist movement was quite unable to exploit the widespread discontent and build mass support. Despite winning 6 parliamentary seats in the October 2001 election, just months before the major unrest, it was unable to capitalize on this result in the 2003 election, falling back to just 5 deputies, and by 2007 there were none. After 2001, there followed almost 10 years of economic growth, rising real wages, and falling unemployment. In the run-up to the 2011 election, 3 of the largest groups, PO, 99 branches in 2022, Partido de los Trabajadores Socialistas, PTS, 65 branches, and Izquierda, which is left in Spanish, Izquierda Socialista, IS, 63 branches, took the unusual step of forming an electoral alliance. The Frente de Izquierda y de los Trabajadores, Workers' Left Front, or FIT. Although its results were fairly poor, the Workers' Left Front continues to this day, having secured between 2.7% and 6.4% of the popular vote in the elections of 2013, 2015, 2017, and 2019, and as of 2021, it has 4 parliamentary deputies. One hallmark of the continued fragmentation of Argentinian Trotskyism is that several groups have chosen to remain outside the Workers' Left Front and contest elections separately. These Autodeterminación y Libertad, MAS, and the Partido Socialista de los Trabajadores Unificado, PSTU, while some of its constituent groups have retained the right to nominate their own candidates in particular seats, Visa PO and Movimiento Socialista de los Trabajadores. Tensions increased in 2019 as debates over the meaning and significance of electoral participation led to a falling out between the PO and its veteran leader, Jorge Altamira, who then launched his own, quote, public faction, end quote, Partido Obrero Tendencia, taking an estimated 1,000 of the PO's 2,500 members. 2 years later, further conflict emerged within the front, the Workers' Left Front. Where am I at? 2 years later, further conflict emerged within the Workers' Left Front as its component parties quarreled over candidate nomination for the 2021 election, leading the MST to insist it would run its own candidates. New section, Britain. The Trotskyist movement in Britain is conventionally dated from the formation of the Balham Group in 1932, following their expulsion from the Communist Party. Although Reg Groves, I think is his name, it just says Groves, and his colleagues made some recruits during the Depression years, they were soon racked by divisions over the issue that plagued other tiny Trotskyist groups around the world, namely whether to continue as an independent revolutionary group or follow Trotsky's advice and enter the leftist Independent Labor Party, ILP, as a secret faction. A few years later, the decline of the Independent Labor Party created yet another split as some activists wanted to persist with the Independent Labor Party entry tactic despite its problems, whilst others now thought the Labor Party a more promising vehicle for Trotskyist agitation. See Bornstein and Richardson, 1986a. Various attempts at unity came to nothing until 1944, when the two major groups fused to form the 350-strong Revolutionary Communist Party. This initiative lasted only 5 years before British Trotskyists once again split apart, although within a few years all had adopted the entry tactic and were operating inside the Labour Party. During the, quote, bleak years, end quote, of the 1950s and early 1960s, the British movement comprised three groups with virtually no influence and very few members. The Orthodox Trotskyists of the, quote, club, end quote, led by Jerry Healy, who had sided with James Cannon and the United States Socialist Workers' Party in the 1953 split, and now belonged to the International Committee of the Fourth International. Ted Grant's Revolutionary Socialist League and the Socialist Review Group committed to Tony Cliff's view that the USSR was a state capitalist regime. According to Cliff, workers neither own nor control the means of production, as an isolated state and economy, the USSR was forced to exploit its workforce in response to its economic and military competition from the capitalist world. When the Korean War began in 1950, the slogan of Cliff's group, "Neither Washington nor Moscow," created a chasm between itself and most of the world Trotskyist movement. In 1950, members of these organizations was around 125, and by 1960, it had risen to approximately 380, helped by recruitment amongst the 10,000 people who had resigned from the Communist Party after Khrushchev's secret speech and the Russian invasion of Hungary. The period from the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s represented the, quote, golden years, end quote, of British Trotskyism, as the economy stagnated, manufacturing industry began its long decline, and industrial conflict surged in response to successive state policies to control wage growth. Meantime, the American war in Vietnam and the escalating violence in Northern Ireland also triggered widespread protests. Trotskyist organizations grew rapidly in this febrile climate, sinking roots in the trade unions, expanding membership inside the Labour Party, and creating highly successful social movements such as the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign in the 1960s and the Anti-Nazi League in the 1970s. Claimed membership of these original groups, later joined by other splinter groups, rose from approximately 1,300 in 1964 to over 20,000 by 1985, a figure that would prove to be the movement's zenith. Meanwhile, Margaret Thatcher's election victory in 1979 marked a watershed in state economic policy, as Keynesian policies rapidly gave way to a variety of neoliberal measures. Over the next few years, manufacturing industry was decimated, unemployment rose to more than 3 million, large public corporations were privatized, welfare benefits were cut, and trade unions were hamstrung with a succession of restrictive labor laws. Union resistance also declined because of significant strike defeats, most notably the coal miners in 1985. Large conservative majorities in Parliament ensured that labor opposition was ineffectual throughout the 18 years of conservative government, but it was not only labor and unions that suffered setbacks. From the mid-1980s and in the wake of the shattering defeat for the coal miners, the Trotskyist movement entered a period of, quote, disintegration and decline, end quote. With the 1985 implosion of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the WRP. Let me make sure I'm saying their name right. Well, I don't actually have internet, so is it World Revolutionary Party or Workers' Revolutionary Party? I can't remember. I think it's Workers' Revolutionary Party. Disintegration declined with the 1985 implosion of the WRP into 11 separate groups and major splits in the Socialist League and the Militant Tendency. The split in the Socialist League says it's 1985 and the Militant Tendency 1992. There were some bright spots, such as the successful militant-led campaign against the poll tax and the ensuing forced resignation of Margaret Thatcher, as well as a brief uptick in SWP membership in the 1990s. See Hannah 2020. Yet over the next 20 years, the problems and challenges of operating in such a harsh economic and political environment slashed the total membership of Trotskyist groups to almost 70%. From the early 2000s, the Trotskyist movement began to recover, drawing inspiration from the anti-global capitalism protest in Seattle in 1999 and embarking on the construction of both electoral coalitions and social movements such as Stop the War, launched in 2001, Respect, launched in 2004, the National Shop Stewards Network of 2007, and the People's Assembly 2013. Yet despite a perfect storm of moderate labor government until 2010, economic recession starting in 2007, draconian austerity policies from 2010, and the COVID pandemic from 2020, the Trotskyist movement had reaped almost no gains from these developments, with membership growth among some groups, e.g. Socialist Appeal and Counterfire, offset by decline and splits elsewhere. The frustration of this largely barren period, including the usual dismal election results, inevitably generated sharp tactical debates, and unsurprisingly, these led to further splits not only in Britain but elsewhere. Between 2012 and 2014, the Socialist Workers' Party was embroiled in a scandal over the rape and sexual harassment of several members by a leading official. The leadership decided to handle the issue internally through a committee including many friends of the accused, and this egregious breach of natural justice resulted in a net membership loss of almost 1,800 in 2 years and the creation of a series of small breakaway groups, only one of which has survived, a small group called Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century, or RS-21. A few years later, the Socialist Party succumbed to a bitter factional struggle within its international body, the CWI, as the British leadership accused its Irish sister party of abandoning, quote, class politics, end quote, in favor of, quote, identity politics, end quote. The upshot was a major split in the British party and the emergence of a 200-strong breakaway socialist alternative. By 2020, the total membership of the Trotskyist movement was little over 9,000, most of it in the Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Party, a figure first reached over 40 years ago in 1979. New section. France. The first Trotskyist group in France held its inaugural conference in 1930, but struggled for several years to expand its tiny membership. In 1934, Trotsky advised the Ligue Communiste to enter the Trotskyist French Socialist Party in order to make recruits, but this, quote, interest, end quote, policy, known as the, quote, French turn, end quote, led to acrimony and division, as it did in Britain and the USA. The League made some recruits before its expulsion a year later, and by 1936, the newly united organization, the Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, came into being and aroused 600 members. Following the German invasion of France, the small Trotskyist movement was subject to both Nazi and communist repression and suffered yet more splits before another unity conference. In 1944, brought most groups into the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, PCI. The international split in 1953 again ruptured French Trotskyism and resulted in a movement comprising the three main groups that would dominate French Trotskyism for the remainder of the century and beyond. The PCI under Pierre Lambert and dissociated internationally with Jerry Healy and James Cannon. Another section of the PCI under Pierre Franck, affiliated to the mainstream Fourth International, better known after the 1963 unification as the United Secretariat of the Fourth International, and the group that would later become Lutte Ouvrière. The movement remained small and marginal through the 1950s, but began to expand amongst students from the early 1960s and amongst trade unions as industrial militancy began to recover in the mid-1960s. The strikes and protests of 1968 dramatically boosted the fortunes of the three Trotskyist groups, particularly the mainstream affiliate, the Ligue Communiste from 1974, the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, LCR, whose membership rose from a few hundred in the mid-1960s to around 3,000 by 1975, the Lambertist group, now known as the Organisation Communiste Internationaliste, continued to expand its influence within student bodies and trade unions, reaching a claimed membership of approximately 7,000 in the early 1980s, whilst the factory agitation of Lutte Ouvrière took its membership to a similar level. Another minor group appeared in the 1970s, including followers of Juan Posadas, Nahuel Moreno, and the U.S.-based Spartacist League, as well as a French group associated with the British Socialist Workers' Party. It is also worth noting that Maoist groups were particularly influential in France compared to other countries, so that in the immediate aftermath of the 1968 events, their combined membership reached around 5,000. Buoyed by their sudden and rapid growth, Trotskyist groups participated in presidential and legislative elections, sometimes separately, sometimes on joint slates, but typically achieved meager results with the vote levels of around 1.1 to 2%. As in Britain and the USA, the late 1970s and early 1980s marked the zenith of Trotskyist membership and influence, but unlike those countries, French Trotskyism experienced only a slow decline over the next 10 to 15 years rather than a catastrophic collapse, as it struggled to deal with the socialist presidency of François Mitterrand of 1981 to 95. Nevertheless, in the early 1990s, Lambert's group, known now as the Parti des Travailleurs, decided to launch a new international body, generally known as the Fourth International Lambertist. Meanwhile, the political right regained the presidency in 1995 with the election of Jacques Chirac, but welfare reforms proposed by Prime Minister Juppé led to the country's biggest general strike since 1968 and the withdrawal of many of the proposed measures. Further general strikes over the next 20 years, particularly around pension reform, also mobilized large numbers and helped slowly improve the membership of the Trotskyist left, whilst the French Communist Party continued its long, slow decline. Again, this background of the 2,000 to 3,000 militants of the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire proposed and launched a new broad left organization, the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste. At its foundation congress in 2009, the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste claimed almost 10,000 members, but over the next 10 years, both the NPA and the Lambertist group, now known as the POI, began to hemorrhage members and experience major splits. Within 4 years of its creation, the NPA had witnessed significant breakaways and disputes over party program, electoral policy, and relations with other leftist organizations, including the Parti de Gauche. I think it's Gauche, as I said, Party of the Left, or the Left Party. Also formed in 2009, Ensemble formed in 2013, including some Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste breakaways, and La France Insoumise, launched in 2016 by the popular politician Jean-Luc Mélenchon. These groups all squeezed NPA membership so that by 2018 it had collapsed to just 2,000, and 3 years later it lost over 300 or so in a fresh breakaway. The Courant Communiste Révolutionnaire, a group linked to an Argentinian international. Meanwhile, the POI suffered a major split in 2015 as the breakaway group, the Parti Ouvrière Indépendant Démocratique, POID, complained that the parent body had become too close to the trade union leaderships and unwilling to promote class struggle from below with sufficient vigor. New section. USA. The USA was one of the first countries to witness the creation of a Trotskyist group, the Communist League of America, CLA, founded in 1929 by James Cannon, Max Shachtman, and others following their expulsion from the American Communist Party. After a few unsuccessful years, the Communist League of America merged with another small group, the American Workers' Party, and then came to prominence through its role in the 1934 Teamsters strike, a major dispute of that period. Under the local leadership of Farrell Dobbs, the newly named Workers' Party boosted its membership to over 500 before following Trotsky's interest policy, the quote French turn, end quote, and operating as a faction inside the Socialist Party from 1936. The entry experiment lasted just 1 year before the Trotskyists were expelled, but their organization, relaunched in 1938 as the Socialist Workers' Party, now comprised over 1,500 members, making it the world's largest Trotskyist group and the most powerful force in the newly created Fourth International. Shortly after the creation of the Socialist Workers' Party, the organization suffered its largest ever split when a group of around 400 members led by Max Shachtman began to question the class nature of the Soviet Union following its invasion of Poland and Finland in September and November 1939, respectively. Despite this damaging split and the continuation of state harassment and Communist Party hostility, by the end of World War II, the Socialist Workers' Party of the USA had again reached a membership of around 1,500, picking up recruits from industrial unions and from the civil rights movement. This early period of membership growth and implantation in the trade union movement was unusual in the world Trotskyist movement, most of whose sections struggled to raise their membership beyond double figures. Yet the next 15 years were to prove remarkably similar to other sections as the Socialist Workers' Party entered the bleak years of the 1950s and early 1960s. The economic and political developments of the immediate post-war period bore very little relation to Trotsky's predictions of economic crisis, Stalinist implosion, and revolutionary upheavals led by the parties of the Fourth International. Yet the Socialist Workers' Party loyalty to Trotsky and the Fourth International, perhaps reinforced by growing Cold War and McCarthyite pressures, led the party to maintain its general political orientation from pre-World War II days. Some internal critics took a different view and under the leadership of Bert Cochran argued that the Socialist Workers' Party was in danger of degenerating into a narrow sect unless it abandoned its vanguard pretensions and sought to build a broad left organization. Other critics of Orthodox Trotskyism now occupied leading positions in the Fourth International and began to argue that in the new and unanticipated world situation, Trotskyist parties should pursue a strategy of long-term entry into social democratic or communist parties. Cannon led the opposition to this departure from orthodoxy and organized a split from the international leadership of Michel Pablo and Ernest Mandel, creating a new Fourth International in 1953. That would be the International Committee. That same year, the, quote, Cochranites, end quote, were expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party, whose membership then slumped below 500 and in 1959 dropped below 400. See Wald, 2016. In the wake of the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the Socialist Workers' Party USA found itself increasingly aligned with the mainstream Fourth International support for the Castro regime, and in 1963, the Socialist Workers' Party USA therefore rejoined the International. This was a controversial decision that would result in several significant splits the following year, leading to the formation of the Spartacist League and the Workers' League associated with the Jerry Healey's Socialist Labor League. Nonetheless, the upsurge of labor militancy and the anti-Vietnam War movement boosted the fortunes of the Trotskyist movement as well as the small Maoist movement. See Fields, 1988, and despite the continuing splits, the Socialist Workers' Party maintained its hegemonic position within the tiny Trotskyist movement. This period marked a turning point for the Socialist Workers' Party as for Trotskyists elsewhere, and by the mid-1970s, party membership had recovered to its pre-World War II level of around 1,500. Nonetheless, the party leadership was concerned about the student and white-collar composition of the party and declared a, quote, turn to industry, end quote, in 1979. The timing was unfortunate as it coincided with the accelerating trend towards deindustrialization and a new cycle of strike defeats starting with the air traffic controllers, PATCO, P-A-T-C-O, in 1980. The party's electoral activity was equally uninspiring, despite standing presidential candidates in every election since 1948. Its most successful vote came in 1976 when Peter Camejo, soon to become a party dissident, polled over 88,000, representing just 0.15% of the total votes cast in the states contested by the party. In 1980, its vote slumped to a little more than 39,000 and has declined ever since, falling below 5,000 in 2020. Early in the 1980s, the Socialist Workers' Party National Secretary Jack Barnes began to shift the political direction of the organization, declaring that the epicenter of the world revolutionary movement no longer rested with the mainstream Fourth International or any of the Fourth International's various offshoots, both the communist parties of Central American countries such as Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada. Barnes' reorientation of Socialist Workers' Party politics towards industry and towards Central American governments was intended to launch the party into a new period of growth. Instead, it marked the first stage of a period of disintegration and decline of American Trotskyism as a whole. The new Socialist Workers' Party line provoked widespread opposition, leading to a series of splits and expulsions over the next few years. The North Star Network 1983, Socialist Action 1983, and the Fourth Internationalist Tendency 1984 were all formed from Socialist Workers' Party factions and involved leading party figures such as Peter Camejo and Paul LeBlanc. Predictably, party members by the mid-1980s had fallen below 1,000 and has never recovered. Two more of the larger Trotskyist groups also succumbed to serious splits. The Spartacist League lost members in the U.S. and 4 other countries to the breakaway International Bolshevik Tendency, IBT, whilst the Workers' League, affiliated with the Helite Workers' Revolutionary Party, or the Helite WRP, because I feel like I'm forgetting the title. It probably is Workers' Revolutionary Party, but I just want to say WRP, so I'm not saying the wrong thing. Also lost members as the WRP and its national sections imploded in 1985. Towards the end of the 1990s, the International Socialist Organization, a small group affiliated to Cliff's International Socialist Tendency, was expelled from that body after disagreements over the significance of the newly emerging anti-globalization movement. I wonder who that entailed, who all was involved in that split. Over the next 15 years or so, a host of new organizations emerged, often as the U.S. outpost of Latin American internationals, e.g. Workers' Voice, LITCI 2008, Socialist Core, UITCI 2010, and Left Voice, FTCI 2015, and these contributed to the further fragmentation of the Trotskyist movement, whose main groups, the Socialist Workers' Party and the Spartacist League, continued their long decline. The only bright spot was the substantial growth of the International Socialist Organization, reaching about 1,000 members by 2018. Yet beneath the apparent success was a growing concern amongst its members about the marginal status of the Trotskyist movement and the relevance of the Leninist model of the vanguard party. These and other doubts were refracted in the International Socialist Organization through a sexual harassment scandal akin to that of the British Socialist Workers' Party in 2012-13, but led rapidly to a majority decision in 2019 to dissolve the entire organization. Other fractures soon appeared, beginning with a division in the ranks of the Socialist Alternative, as its sister party in Britain fomented a split in its international body, the CWI, in a campaign to defend Trotskyist orthodoxy against the, quote, heresy of, quote, identity politics, end quote. The same year witnessed splits in 2 smaller organizations, the International Bolshevik Tendency and Socialist Action, as well as the death of James Robertson, founder of the Spartacist Tendency, and of the dozens or so tiny groups in its international body. James Robertson's death in 2019 threw the organization into chaos, and over the next year or so, its U.S. fortnightly, Workers' Hammer, gradually wound down and since mid-2020 has disappeared. By 2022, even the largest groups in the USA existed in only a few dozen locations, namely Socialist Alternative with 26 branches and Solidarity with 25. 1 second. Conclusions. Trotskyist militants first appeared in the late 1920s and early 1930s as they began to build organizations, publish newspapers, recruit new members, and try to build counterweights to the pro-Soviet communist parties, hampered by scarce resources, communist and social democratic hostility, chronic tendencies towards organizational splits, and in some cases, acute state repression. The early Trotskyist movement remained small and utterly marginal through many, quote, bleak years, end quote, well into the 1960s. Only then did the movement enter its, quote, golden age, end quote, as the world strike wave and the rise of anti-imperialist social movements brought new generations of militants into political activity. Often disillusioned with communism after the 1956 secret speech and the invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, some of these young militants found their way into the anti-Stalinist left, swelling the ranks of the hitherto tiny Trotskyist groups. This resurgence began somewhat later in Latin America, once the repressive military dictatorships began to fall, but in different countries and at different times between the late 1970s and the 1980s. The Trotskyist movement achieved its highest ever levels of membership and influence. What then followed was a period of disintegration and decline as major parties in Argentina, Britain, and the USA succumbed to major schisms that devastated their membership levels. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were a period of status with some limited recovery of membership and political influence, more in Argentina and France, but the absence of any major breakthrough after the years of neoliberal austerity and numerous, quote, cycles of protest, end quote, around the world has ushered in yet another period of splits, decay, and decline. That's the end of the essay. Here are some notes. Note 1. Other parties that have claimed membership in 4 figures include the Algerian Parti Socialiste des Travailleurs, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Convergencia Socialista in Brazil, 2000 and 1983, the Peruvian Partido Revolucionario de los Trabajadores, 5,000 in the early 1980s, and the Spanish Liga Comunista Revolucionario, 3,500 in 1978. See Alexander, History of International Trotskyism. Membership of the Sri Lanka LSSP was reported to be 25,000 in 1970, although by that time it had ceased to be a Trotskyist party. See JUP 1978. Much of the information in this chapter is drawn from the following sources: Alexander, 1991, Borstein and Richardson, 1986, Brightman, LeBlanc and Wald, 2016, Callahan, 1984, Kalinikos, 1990, Fields, 1983, Frank and Ben Said, 2010, Hobday, 1986, Joshua, 2013, Kelly, 2018, Sagra, 2011, Shepard, 2012, Smith and Worley, 2014, 2017, and Wolforth, 1994. 3. On the history of Posadas, an increasingly bizarre figure and his cultish followers around the world, see Gitlitz, 2020. 4. This organization is also known as the Fourth International, La Vérité, after the name of its magazine in the Fourth International, 1994, after the year of its foundation. All right, the end.